This screencast is going to be about the Dynabook project, and it looks at the Dynabook dream from a user's perspective. So much of the things that have been written about a Dynabook really look at, from a high level, a programming team creating this tool to unleash creative spirit and to augment the human intellect. But I wondered for a long time what that would look like as an actual user working with that for quite a long time. So I decided to publish the results of my work and open source it. So a big part of the Dynabook dream to me is that it erases this really accidental, tragic concept of application stovepipes, where we have a contact application and a application for dealing with files, and maybe we have an application for dealing with URL bookmarks, and then we have an application like Calibre to deal with our digital works. And it's questionable, highly questionable, how interactive and interoperable any of those are. So the Dynabook erases all that. So let's look at some of the components so far in this particular Dynabook project. So we're going to look at a few in general in this screencast. So one is this concept of resources, which abstracts away files. So you kind of put a file into this library, and from then on you say, I don't care where it lives, although I'm free to specify a policy about where to put it under different conditions. But if I don't specify, just stick it wherever you stick resources generally, and give me back something that represents a file. So I might put an MP3 file in and get an audio resource out that lets me play it in a player, and etc. The next thing we're going to look at is, so QuoteMe is a little service that deals with quotes and citations. So-and-so said whatever, and this is the reference, on page whatever of this particular book. Another part we're going to look at is a living library. So this is a reimagination of what a library could be. So picture a public library with books and magazines and videos, etc. But it encompasses the digital and physical worlds as completely as we can. And we're also going to look at a component called My People, which is an address book service. So these things are all on the same level. They're all objects in the same world, and they can talk to each other and interact and access each other's objects and stores each other's objects with no real interface needed. Everything is freely available, which is the magic of Smalltalk. So to install the Dynabook in a GT image, and I should say that ideally the project and its components should be loadable in Vanilla Faro, most recent release, or GT, but I will say that I program almost exclusively in GT. So if you want the best experience, and many of the UI components are only implemented in GToolkit, that's really where you want to load it. So here's your load script. And the first thing you might notice when you open up an image, a GT image with the Dynabook installed, is it gives you this row of tools here. So the address book is that My People. It's most of the libraries have a singleton instance that is the highest level object that is your entry point. So for My People, it's this address book singleton. We didn't talk about the accounting service, but this is your personal books for financial transactions. This is the living library, so this is your authored works, digital or physical. This is a project management service that we're not going to talk about in this particular screencast. This is your resource library, where we mentioned you put the files and you get an abstract domain object back. This is all the objects contained in the Dynabook, so it encompasses all of these components into one database that you can then serialize. By default, it uses Fuel, so when you come into a new image, you have all your Dynabook objects. And these are just some utilities. This restarts the Python bridge, which various Dynabook components use behind the scenes. And it can be a little bit finicky sometimes in GT, so sometimes it's just easy to easiest to restart when you get into trouble. This will take you to the Dynabook baseline. And this is if only really if you're working on home sections in the GT homepage. The changes don't necessarily get picked up right away for existing worlds, so it just refreshes the home screen for the world. So what we're going to look at is when you start, you're going to be dealing with your singleton instances here. So we're going to look at an example of a YouTube video. Okay, so we have Brett Victor's talk.
Whilst in the maze are.
Stop Drawing Dead Fish, and it's on YouTube. So let's say that I was interested in this talk. I wanted to watch it. I wanted to remember where it was, and I wanted to maybe take some notes on it. So we're going to copy this URL and see what we can do with it in the Dynabook. So now I'm just going to, at this point, draw a distinction. The first way we're going to look at the components is individually. So we're going to go into the living library component and look at some examples related to YouTube videos and how you might model those. Then we're going to go up a level because one of the beauties of the Dynabook Dream, which I mentioned, is that these applications are not applications, they're services on the same level that can talk to each other. So while you could just use the living library, and we'll look at how to do that in the examples, then we're going to look at how to tie it all together into a real Dynabook and talk about some of the advantages there. So instead of going into this singleton, which is my library, I'm just going to open up the library class and look at some examples. So we have here an example of a YouTube video. So the first thing to notice is that YouTube videos are modeled directly. And so here we have the capability of creating a YouTube video from an ID. But actually, and I should probably update the example, that's not the easiest way. So let's look at how I would really do it if I was starting with a new video. So one of the great things about GT is that you end up, for each type of class, you end up having some relevant snippets that you use over and over and over in the inspector. So the easiest way to starting from a video in YouTube to model that in the Dynabook in the living library, we're just going to take the link string that we got in the URL bar in our browser, and we're going to say YouTube video from link string, and that's going to give us our video object. So now let's go back to the living library example, which is going to take what we just did, an instance of a YouTube video, which is interesting on its own right. You can have a player, you can pause it, you can play it, you can seek, but it doesn't have a lot of, as a computing artifact, it doesn't have a lot of meta information. And in YouTube, that's maybe a little bit less true because you do have a title, but you'll notice that the YouTube model is not very rich. So it doesn't have a concept of an author and a title and maybe where Brett gave this speech. It would just jam all that into the title. So we want to have something a little bit more rich. So even this title is not exactly what we're going to use one for one. So if we go into here and look at this YouTube video as a computing artifact, what that actually is going to be is a copy. In other words, something that we can actually deal with, interact with, of an authored work, which is a slightly higher level concept. So we have the actual title and the actual author. And even that author is not going to be a string the way it is in YouTube, but it's going to be a person object. And in this case, we have an example showing how to set up a person object. So now, having said all that, if we run this overall example, we have a library with an authored work called Stop Drawing Dead Fish, authored by Brett Victor, and we have a copy of it on YouTube. Now you might say, for a YouTube video, is that like kind of a little too finicky of a distinction? Because for a YouTube video, you could kind of say that a lot of times the work and the copy are kind of the same thing. But you have to realize that the living library is a generic model to to handle all of the cases that we deal with. And even for a YouTube video, you might have been at the talk where Brett spoke about Stop Drawing Dead Fish, and maybe they gave you a USB stick with the recording on it. So you might have two copies. One would be the YouTube video, and one would be the MP4 or what have you that you have locally. And so if you're just going to view it or take notes on it, those copies, there's not much of a distinction, but it may be important that you know that you have two copies. There may be an issue where you don't have an internet connection and you're going to use a local copy. You may want to remember where the YouTube video is because you may want to comment on YouTube about it. So it gives you a very flexible model to handle a lot of different cases. So now we're going to look at how we would handle this inside the Dynabook. And so inside the Dynabook, we would go to our living library singleton instance, which I'm not going to do because that's my library. So what we'll do is to get a instance to play with, an empty instance, we'll just make a new library. And so there's 0 works in here. And now the easiest way to create works inside the library is we have a few spotters, and there are searching spotters, and there are spotters to create new works. So we're just going to type the title, Dead Fish, and it doesn't know that work, and it asks if we want to create it. So yes, we want to create Stop Drawing Dead Fish, and that will give us an inspector on Stop Drawing Dead Fish. Now, remember, this is the Dynabook now. So instead of just creating the author as a value object inside the authored work, we're going to actually create it in the address book where it belongs. And so we'll get another example address book here. And so there's a few different contacts, a few different views, and you'll notice that the address book can have people and can have organizations. And so this particular address book does not contain Brett Victor yet. So we're going to type Brett Victor. Now you'll notice that in this particular model, an address book thinks that a person should have at least 2 names. It's going to try and parse it into at least a first and last name. So right now there's only 1 token. So it just gives you the option to create an organization. The second you start a second token, it says, okay, now this might actually be a person. And it gives you a new option to create a person, Brett Victor. So now we have a person object, Brett Victor. And if you go into the name and actually parse it out into a first and last name. Now, you can have generationals. Now, it obviously doesn't cover every case internationally, but it's a proof of concept, and it covers most of my use cases so far. So now, this is where we link it up. So now we have a person object in one tool, and we have an authored work object in another tool. Now, how do we get the one into the other? And right now, we have a working solution. We hope to have something a little more elegant, and these things are being refined, as we go. But what you'll find yourself in GT is that for each, and we probably mentioned this before, for each class type, you have relevant snippets that you use over and over. So for an authored work, some of the relevant snippets are dealing with authors and creating copies. So in this case, we have this variable that's currently unbound that we can either add as an author or make the sole author of the work. And so what we're going to do is take Brett Victor, and we're going to use this binding tool, which you get as part of the Dynabook project installed automatically. And we're going to go to the tool with the authored work, Stop Drawing Dead Fish, and we're going to go into the authored work inspector, and we're going to bind the author variable to Brett Victor. So now if we go back here, we'll see that this is now bound to our Brett Victor object. And then we can evaluate this snippet. And if we go to the raw view, we'll see that, yes, now Brett Victor is the author. And then the other part of that is the copy. So we're going to go LL YouTube video, like we did before, from link string. Gives us our YouTube video object. And we combine this one and the author work to the copy variable, and then we'll see that that copy variable is now bound to the YouTube video, and we're going to add the copy to the library. So now if we go back to our library, we now have, let me just get another one here. Okay, so now in works, we have our work, we have our copy, we have our title, we have our author. And so now from an authored work, you can create a, you can play it and take notes. And right now, that particular tool is called a transcript. So I have one set up. So we're going to flip to that in my personal database, a transcript that I already took a few notes on Stop Drawing Dead Fish. So this is the instance of the work Stop Drawing Dead Fish from my personal library. And as you can see, I already have a transcript where I took a few notes. And the embedded view here in the inspector is very basic. It gives you a raw timestamp, author, and quote. But the view that we're really interested in is the Lepeter page. Now, because I already have a transcript, I have this transcript view, and I can go to the Lepeter page here. But I'll just show you how to do that. If you didn't have a transcript, you just send transcript to the authored work. It will make one for you if you need one. And then from the transcript, if you go to Lepeter page, it will also create a Lepeter page if you don't have one. And then once you have one, you can get it right from the transcript view. So you'll notice there's some player controls here. Pretty much the full, in this case, HTML5 video API is available to you, but these are a few that I commonly use that I implemented. So we can play. And in this particular case, the way my workflow is, I have YouTube videos set up. The player is Safari via Apple Events. So we can obviously
Ghost that's running through the maze.
Play and pause. We can, let me bring it back to the beginning. And you'll notice these quotes have timestamps. So if we click on the timestamp, it will seek the video to the timestamp of when he actually said that thing.
What does this art medium provide that no medium in the past has ever provided?
You can speed it up.
The answer to that is simulation. Digital characters can behave.
And now if we seek somewhere else, when we create another snippet, so sometimes when you're taking notes, I'm done with that note, I might reflexively hit enter to create a new snippet. But then I'm going to sit there and wait for another quote that I find interesting. So it won't actually give you a timestamp.
I'm going to make an analogy here because I don't
until you start typing in. So let's say
I improvise on the piano.
I improvise on the piano. So let's say
likewise, like the rules of animation, there are rules.
So let's say I've found that quote to be interesting, like the rules of animation. I would start typing in my quote, and it gave me a timestamp as soon as I started typing it in. Now, eventually, we're probably going to need some tools to fine-tune the playhead position here, because there'll be a few seconds elapsed by the time I realize that it's something I'm interested in. So we may want to back up a standard amount, like 3 to 5 seconds. But you can do that in the in here, and it will pick it up. So we'll get rid of that. There are also other types of copies that you could create. So to see those, all right, so we'll go to YouTube video. So we can see LL YouTube video is an LL web video. So an LL web video is any HTML5 video. So you would basically has all the capabilities, but just instead of using the YouTube player API, it uses HTML5 video API. And then this is actually a web resource and library item. So then if we look at the subclasses here, you can see we have a lot of different kinds of physical resources. These are all non-file resources. So we have some physical things, which you might say it's on a CD, and you may have the location of the CD in your library, so you know which drawer you left it in. Oop, that's going to be a problem. Oops. So we have some physical resources like CDs and DVDs. Now you might say, why would you model that in the computer? Well, when you have it modeled, it gives you the opportunity to note where it's actually located. So you can remember which drawer it's in, but going into a little bit more, I guess, obvious things to model, you could have a Flickr photo, Google Play Books, Kindle Book, Vital Source Books, and you have a few different types of videos here. And they're all pluggable into the being copies of authored works and to create transcripts while being played. So that's one example of a Dynabook component, and also how to tie it into the larger Dynabook to fully harness the capabilities of the Dynabook Dream. Hope it helps.